Thank you. You are a gift. If you'd like to sit in the audience, you may be free to do that. You certainly are a gift, and we're very appreciative. We've been talking about the 5 principles, and I've probably worn you out by now. And I promise this is my last Sunday to do that. So you might have wondered, though, there are a couple of other things I haven't mentioned as we've been talking about the 5 principles, and that is, how does unity look at the Bible? What does unity teach about Jesus? Well, I think most of you know that unity certainly has taught that we look at the Bible. We can look at it several different ways, whichever way serves you best. Historically, you may look at it metaphysically. That's certainly what Charles Fillmore did. He took the Bible and he would look at the meaning behind the words. Some of it we certainly look at historically. I do, and certainly with the all of the books of the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, the Old and the New Testament. To me, they are a compilation of the thinking at the time, the consciousness of the time. For instance, the book of Lamentations. I don't know how you look at it, metaphysically, metaphorically, historically, any sort of way, and take anything terribly positive from it, except that we recognize this was the consciousness, the culture at the time. It's what they believed. It's what they thought. They were extremely superstitious, fearful, didn't know if they might fall off the edge of the earth. Remember that? And so to me, all of my life, I have found it to be something that can be extremely beautiful in places like some of the books of the Psalms. Is there anything any more beautiful than the words of the shepherd David? So beautiful, and we accept those for what they are. So take what speaks to you and leave the rest, I guess is what I would encourage you to do. If it speaks to you, then use it. And if not, then don't. And I believe with New Thought, that is what has historically happened. You can even look at the teachings of Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. And this was before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi books of the Bible that had been hidden. All of those books that were discovered in the 40s or 50s, they knew nothing of that. They knew nothing of that. And so I think that we have to, as we go along, we have to rethink and say, what do I believe? What do I feel? What makes sense to me? What makes sense to me? What sort of view do I have of God? It's not of a God up there somewhere that is a puppet master, but there is a power. There's one power and presence in the universe, and we call this power God. We call it divine. We call it many words, whatever. You don't even have to call it anything. You can just call it an energy, or no, there's an energy in the universe that's all loving. That's our first principle, principle 1. And what has happened with these is that over the years, the Fillmore's granddaughter found it useful. Instead of all of these various teachings, she found it very useful to bring them down, all of these teachings, into 5 basic principles. So within them, they can't say every single thing, but I think they cover it all. I think using these 5 principles, I can live my life every day using that. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the 5th principle, which is putting them all into practice. We can live the truth that we know. So principle 1, there's only one power and one presence in the universe, active and in my life, God the good. God is all powerful. So we saw that to live the first principle is to become grateful. We become grateful, don't we, for whatever appears in our lives. We must have gratitude. And I think that's one of the things that will break us out of the life that we were living. When we want to become a new person, we want to become happy and whole, is to start being grateful for everything that we can. Start to heal those things that have happened to you in your lifetime. Start to heal them. So one of the ways we do that is to, we acknowledge that we are one. Principle 2, our essence is of God, therefore we are inherently good. This essence called the Christ was expressed through Jesus. Do we think that Jesus was the exception? No. We don't teach that Jesus was the exception. We teach that Jesus was the example of how we can live the Christ consciousness, and that we can remember, he said, what I do, you can do. You are the light of the world. He didn't say, I'm the only light of the world. I'm it. He said, you're the light of the world. What I do, you can do. And so what we teach here that's a little bit different from other places that you might have been is that we still revere and love and live by the teachings of Jesus. These are all based on Jesus' teachings, all of these principles. But we recognize that he was the great example, and he was telling us how we can live. We believe in principle 2 that we were not born into sin. We were born into blessing. And so we take the example of the one who expressed the Christ Spirit, and we aspire toward that. Principle 3, we're co-creators with God, creating our reality through our thoughts held in mind. We recognize this as the law of mind action. Our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs have the power to create our reality. In other words, how we see our experience and what we make of our experience create our reality. And there are several ways to look at that, and we'll talk about that another time in depth. But to live these principles, we recognize our own innate goodness, the goodness of others, and we act accordingly. So we see the best in each other and the best in ourselves. So we truly behold the Christ. And as we saw, by practicing the second principle is to become more loving, more forgiving, more compassionate, more interested in the awe and the goodness of everything around you. And using the first and second principles as a foundation for practicing the third principle, we saw that living it requires us to always examine our thoughts, our beliefs, and our opinions, and to be willing to let go of those that do not fully support us. Now, how can you do that? You can do that on a daily basis, can't you? By if you start feeling uncomfortable, worried, you're watching the news, you have a knot in your stomach, what's that telling you? You've got some angst going there, and you don't necessarily need to hold that, do you? So maybe you could change your thought. Maybe you could change your thought to say, I'm an observer of this. I like to observe what's going on in the world. I like to know what's going on. I don't want to live in a cave. I want to know what's going on with everyone so that I can pray for them. But I don't know that I want to bring all the troubles into the world into my own body. That's certainly not going to make me well, is it? All that worry and angst. So if we can, when we look at our thoughts, and if you're feeling uncomfortable, and you're feeling a sense of worry, you need to change your thoughts and let it go. And what you have to remind yourself of is that you can change your thoughts. You can change your thinking. Many of us didn't know that when we were growing up. We didn't know that. We were told to change our behavior, weren't we? And to conform, but we were not necessarily told to be free thinkers, were we? I know in my husband's family they were, because I remember my mother-in-law, Dan's mother, recounting a time when the kids were young and she was trying to teach them to be good losers when they were playing some sort of game, and one of them had won and two of them had lost, and they were whining and whatever was going on. But she was trying to teach them good manners, and she was very sweetly telling them, well, now someone always has to be the loser in whatever game you're playing. And Mr. Voght heard her and came into the room, and he said, oh, no, they don't. Don't you teach my kids to be losers. I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And I always was interested in the way that, those of you that know my husband, you know how bold and courageous he is, and there's not a thing he can't do. He thinks except play an instrument, he can't do that. He says he can tune a carburetor, but he can't... if you need an instrument tuned, he's not your guy. But I was always amazed at that. I was amazed at the way he and his brothers and sisters were raised and taught how to be. But his dad was very intentional, not certain where it came from. He came from a family in Indianapolis that was, the mother was ill and the dad died, and he had to help keep the mom going during very, very difficult times, World War I. And his dad sent himself to Purdue and helped support his mother, then became an engineer, worked on the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate. They lived in Sausalito in a big old mansion just while the Golden Gate Bridge was being built. Just beautiful, beautiful memories. I'll share some of that with you sometime. We have some amazing photographs of the Golden Gate without the floor and just some... But anyway, my husband had a lot of teaching like that I didn't hear as a child. Maybe some of you did. How many of you were raised in a family like that where your parents told you you could do anything you wanted to do? Good. Good. And I hope you're walking the talk. I hope you're doing that. That's wonderful. He's taught me a lot about being more courageous and of course, taught our kids to do the same thing. But I've gotten off track. I was talking about the 5 principles instead of my husband. Get me going too far, and I'll start talking about how he looks like a pretty intelligent guy. He looks pretty intelligent, but when he comes in with his dirty shoes on and walks across the floor, and I'm thinking, You look fairly smart, but you can't look at the bottom of your shoe and know that there's dirt on it. If you put it over here on the floor, you might leave a little residue. Anyway, I had to give you that. I've bragged about him a little too much, and I don't want to leave you with that. Yeah, he'll get the big head. We don't want that. So our fourth principle we talked about last week is to become aware of your soul's needs. Set aside time each day for regular quiet meditation. How you go within. You can't even hear your thoughts or know who you are if you don't have enough time in the quiet. I recognized many, many, many years ago, decades ago, that I could not stand the television on in the morning. It wasn't even allowed to be turned on in our house. I didn't want any noise at all. If you come in to get your coffee, be quiet. And it was because, and I didn't have words to put to it then, I just called it my quiet time, and I still call it that, my quiet time. But I know what it is my time to go within and to commune with God, that first principle, the one power and the one presence, and that connection from my heart and my mind with God. That's when I will hear the voice of God in that quiet time. And if you're a person that can't stand quiet, then you need to work on that. You need to work on being able to sit still. And it doesn't have to be forever. Just enough time to restore yourself so that you can hear your own thoughts. So that was the fourth principle that we talked about last week, and that is that we need to quiet our minds long enough that we can hear. We can hear. You may say you're hearing the voice of God. You may say that you are hearing your higher self. And the higher self is connected to the higher power and one and the same. So however you feel about it, go with that. But do spend time in the quiet. I work with students with the ministerial school, and one of the men had, in his assignment, had said that he'd been working on his wife, that he spends a full hour in meditation every morning and every evening. And that he felt like his wife didn't spend enough time in meditation. He'd been wanting her to spend more time. And so just as an aside, I sent back a personal note to him, and I said, well, I think that's good of you, and you certainly have the right intentions, but that's not for you to say. That's for her to say. And while that may work for you, I even told him, I said, that won't work for me. An hour in the morning and an hour in the evening won't work for me, because all I need, maybe I'm doing the condensed version, I'm not sure. Maybe like a condensed book, I'm doing the condensed meditation, but I don't need an hour. It's a little bit too long for me. And so I encouraged him to allow her to do what works for her. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because Ellen Davenport, who wrote the book, The 5 Principles, she said if she could do it over again, she would have had a 6th principle, and that would have been to mind your own business. Okay? So I'll just throw that one in there right now. Let's talk about that one for a moment, since I've thrown it in there early. What do you think? Have you ever gotten into trouble by minding someone else's business? Have you? Okay. We do that, don't we? We do that. I think in relationship is the hardest, and maybe those are our biggest challenges, because where does your space end and mine begin? Where does my clean floor and the importance of that matter in your... And so, but she's really extremely funny about her presentation of the 5 principles, and then if she could do that book over, that she has seen so much of that, that we get into so much trouble when we're borrowing someone else's problems. And even when you're praying, if you're going to get down in that level with them where you're worrying and all you've got is negative energy coming out, stop. Because what you want to be doing is going into your heart and praying wellness, praying joy, praying all things good. You don't want to even throw a negative emotion into it. Not at all. Not at all. So what we're talking about further this morning is how do we live our truths? And we've spoken that as we've gone along with each principle, and what do we do to keep our thoughts positive? What do we do to have enough quiet every day? What do we do to remind ourselves that we have a direct connection to God? So what does it really mean to live the 5th principle? It means through our thoughts, words, and actions, we are willing to live the truth that we say we know. How many times have you said something or maybe to your children or whatever, and the next thing you know, you're doing exactly the opposite? Yeah. We think everyone else should drive the speed limit. Yeah, they're just, a few examples of how we have in our mind what's good for us, but sometimes we will, even with New Thought, and sometimes especially with New Thought, people get on the spiritual path and they'll let the ego guide them there too. My way's the only way. My way of meditation's the only way. My way of prayer is the only way that works. My way of everything is the only way. And so we need to keep the ego out of it, whatever we're doing. And even if we think we're doing good, we can get that ego into it and decide that our way is the only way. And so to live the truths that we know, it takes a bit of discipline. What do you think about that word? That can be sort of an ugly word if we think about it. Discipline, it was used with disciplining children. That doesn't sound very good, does it? Applying discipline to the world. So it may not be a great word, but it does have meaning for us. The other day I heard a story about Gandhi that helped me understand one of the blind spots in walking the path, the spiritual path, the path of the heart. A mother needed help with her little boy who had an obsession with sugar, so she went to seek Gandhi's help. She said, "Gandhi, my son consumes far too much sugar. Will you please tell him to stop eating sugar?" He refused to give the boy advice and told her to return in 1 month. So she left, a little bit disappointed. So a month later they returned, and when she asked him again, he immediately pulled the child aside and told him it would be best if he quit eating so much sugar. Well, she was irate. She pulled him aside. She was curious why he needed a month to give him that advice. "Surely you knew that then," she said. He smiled to her and he said, "A month ago, I was eating a lot of sugar myself." So how many times do we do that? I try to be careful when I'm talking here on Sundays to only tell you things that I know that will work. And I know that we can discipline our thoughts. I know that we can stop ourselves right in the middle of a bad thought. We can stop it right there and turn it around. And I know that because I've done it. I've done it. I've lived it. And I know you can too. You can do it. You can turn it around. So there was another teacher he had recommended this story about Gandhi. He said that after reading it, he'd wondered if there were any areas in his life that he needed to give himself that same advice. And he said it wasn't any time that he had suggested to a client that she forgive a friend who'd pulled away and stopped returning phone calls and texts and any type of communication. And he had just said to her, well, forgive and let that go. And it was later on in the same week he saw himself in a situation where a friend had done exactly the same thing to him, yet he was feeling unwilling to forgive. So he had to give himself a little comeuppance about that and say, when am I willing to walk the talk? And if I give advice to one of my clients, I'm going to make sure it's advice I have or can follow and following right now. I thought about it the other day. I had, I guess it was last week, I'd gone for an annual checkup, and as they do, they send you down to the lab for blood work, just to check everything out and make sure it's okay. So I'd gone down to the lab, and I'm sitting there, and I noticed there's a really young lady standing there, and the other lab tech that I recognized, and she smiles at me and she says, we have a student here today. Do you mind if she takes your blood? So I had a couple of seconds of, split seconds of, I think so. And then I thought, okay, hold on a minute. It just that quickly, you can go from that fearful thought to know it's all God. She's of God, I'm of God. There's nothing to this. And so I just rolled up my sleeve and I said, okay, fine, that sounds good. And she did get it twisted a little bit, and it did. The more mature technician had to get it unstuck there for a moment, but we were okay, and it didn't bother me a bit. I was fine. But it was a good lesson for me too, because right in that split second of fear, I said, now wait a minute. How's anybody ever going to learn? How are they ever going to learn if we don't allow them? If we don't teach them? And that was a teaching moment for all of us, I think. I'm going to relax and let go and make this as easy for her as possible. I did it for her and not me. But it worked out for all of us. But I gave you that example this morning. It's just a silly one, but it's a real one. It's one of the examples we end up with in the world, isn't it? We're stuck in traffic. We've got someone in front of us that's driving 20 in a 45-mile zone. We have all sorts of things that are going on in the world. And we don't even need to even think about what's going on with politics. I would encourage you to do this when you get all torn up about some of that. Let it go. Here's a way you could walk the talk this week, okay? Do it as a favor to me. And it'll be a favor to you too. When you see something that comes up, and it just has you all torn apart and you want to take action, ask if you can see it differently. How could I see this one situation differently today and practice being the Christ in this experience. How could I do that? So I just pray for each of you that you will take a little something from today. Practice those 5 principles, and if you'd like to have a copy of that book, we still have a few left, the 5 principles, and if we don't have enough, we'll get some more. So I pray the best for you. Pray great weather, blessings all around. And for those challenges, and we know we'll have them, we pray that we'll get through them as easily as possible. Now, thank you for your time.